paranormal and supernatural stuff. I was afraid of Satan. I was afraid of demons. I was afraid of angels. I was afraid of God. I had somehow seen the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and God was way scary in that movie. I was afraid of ghosts. We had a pet rabbit at one point. I would hear him rattling his cage at night, and even though I'm pretty sure a more rational part of me knew that it was just the rabbit rattling its cage, part of me was pretty sure that it was a ghost. I was afraid of aliens. I once stayed up all night staring at the wall of my bedroom because I was pretty sure that if I rolled over in bed, a big headed, big eyed little green man would be staring at me unblinkingly, and I couldn't risk it. 2 years later, in 1993, Sunday evening, 9 p.m., would become the most terrifying 2 minutes of my life because my parents would send me to bed, and then my dad would turn on The X Files, and I would hear Mark Snow's theme, the scariest TV show theme other than Twilight Zone and Medium with Patricia Arquette. I would hear this music and be convinced that the most horrific things in the world were on my living room TV set. My name is Calvin. So people always ask me if I liked Calvin and Hobbes growing up. I did. But even more than Calvin, the cartoon boy I identified with the most was Charlie Brown. Because like Charlie Brown, I had pantophobia. I was afraid of everything. I would have dreams of being chased by something, no matter how fast I ran. Whatever the thing that was chasing me would be right behind me. What was chasing me would always change from time to time. Sometimes it was snakes, or a shark like in Jaws, or a Shredder from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Darth Vader. I was very afraid of Darth Vader. I would freak out when Luke would take his helmet off at the end of the Return of the Jedi, and that vein would be bulging out of his head. I couldn't take it. I only wanted to watch Star Wars because Star Wars, meaning Episode 4, A New Hope, was the least scary Star Wars movie. Darth Vader would be chasing me. I'd run fast. He was always right behind me. I was afraid of skeletons. But you know what is even more scary than a skeleton chasing you? An all metal robot skeleton with glowing red eyes chasing you. It has no pity or remorse, and it cannot be stopped. Back in 1991, they used to re release classic Disney movies in the movie theaters. There are some very scary moments in classic Disney movies. The worst one for me is when Pinocchio is playing pool with that other kid and they start to turn into donkeys, and then the shadow guys with whips take them away with all the other kids who turned into donkeys. That is scary stuff. Pinocchio is a scary movie about a non real person who desperately wants to become a real person and pays a bitter price. But in 1991, we were going to go see Peter Pan. And Disney Peter Pan is not that scary. But I was terrified because in the lobby of the movie theater was a poster for Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that giant robot skeleton with the glowing red eyes was staring right at me. And I was convinced that the movie theater would accidentally switch film reels. I was smart. I knew how movies worked. I was afraid that they would accidentally switch movie reels and that instead of Peter Pan, I would see the Terminator coming after me. And this made me so afraid that I almost threw up and had to go home. But somehow I kept it together and got to see Peter Pan, which is a wistful story about children leaving their parents behind and eventually growing up, all except one. Fast forward to 2008, January 13th, 2008 to be specific. I'm in college. George W. Bush is president. I'm much older and wiser than when I was 6. And I sat down in my living room of the apartment that I lived in and paid for with my own money. I sat down to watch television, actual television, analog broadcast television, the Fox network, the same network that provided my father with 9 long years of X-Files, and that had given me not one, but 2 short-lived Joss Whedon science fiction shows. I sat down to watch Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, because on some deep level, I wanted to be chased by a robot skeleton with glowing red eyes. Why? That is what this show is about. My name is Calvin. My co-host is Ian. Come with us if you want to live.
Insert Terminator theme song here. Thank you, Calvin. As Calvin just said, I'm Ian, and this is our podcast, Come With Me If You Want to Live.
So, Ian, when did you first watch Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles? Because like I said, I remember a very specific moment. Like I sat down on a couch and watched it when it was being broadcast on TV. It wasn't a streaming service. It wasn't a DVD that I rented from the library. It was just like you had to sit down at the specific time on a specific day and watch this thing with commercials because that's when it was on.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I have never watched this on TV. I was in college, and I want to say this was just before a tornado hit my college, and I was displaced for a couple weeks. And so I watched it on the Fox website, um, which was actually part of the whole writer's strike that, in most people's analysis, kind of killed the show. It was actually a very complicated situation that led to the show ending. But in 2007, 2008, there was a writer's strike, and that um, was largely about the new online media presence. Instead of watching things on what we now call the direct market on TV, where you have a revenue stream guaranteed by advertisements, there are all these new things like YouTube and streaming the show on video on demand on the website of the broadcaster. So I watched all of season one on the Fox website. Although I actually missed an episode, so I only watched 8 of the original 9 episodes when they came out, and then I watched part of season 2 many years later. Because the season finale of season 1 kind of bummed me out, actually, so I didn't watch season 2 when it came out. I was part of the problem. um, Also, I wasn't in college anymore, so I wasn't watching as much TV. I watched it, I think, when it was on Amazon Prime, and I watched about half of the second season, including the last 5 episodes that form the finale on Amazon Prime. And then recently, I bought it on Blu-ray for this podcast, and I've watched through the entire thing, and it is wonderful. So the first thing we should say is this is a spoiler discussion show. This is not an advertising show where we say this is the premise, now you should go watch it. We're saying go watch it and then come back and listen, and then talk to us, leave comments, and send us emails.
Right. So I sat down to watch this show, and it has a cold open,
This is
which
network
is of
television.
course, a very which is a writing structure that is very specific to network television. The purpose, for those of you who are youngins and don't know, um, a cold open. The purpose of having a cold open, which is a very exciting opening scene that may or may not have anything to do with the actual plot of the television of the episode that you're watching. Um, it's meant to grab the attention of someone who is randomly flipping through channels at the turn of the hour. And so you would have this what's called a cold open, uh, uh, a scene that's meant to grab the attention of the viewer and say, "Hey, you should watch this show," as opposed to the dozens of other possible shows that you could watch, or if you go back even further in time, the less than dozens of possible shows that you could watch.
Well, I think also a cold open was meant to try and start and grab people who had been watching the previous show. So they wouldn't see the theme song and be like, oh, I'm done, I'm leaving. Instead, they see huge disaster with robots. I must know what happens next.
Yes, that is another possibility, uh, especially back during the age of analog broadcast television, is that you would be watching a station and then you might just keep watching that station to see what came on after the show that you had just watched. That's a good point.
Do you think that
So
network
this cold
television?
open is the it was an all dream. It was all a dream. The worst kind of cold open, or are there worse kinds?
I would argue worse kinds are sitcoms where they do an entire 5-minute cold open that's just a joke and then nothing relating to that happens later. But dream sequences are definitely up there.
Okay, here's what frustrates me, Ian, is that even though very few people watch broadcast network television anymore, the viewership for broadcast network television has gone way down. Um, there are still streaming services where the writers, who I guess were trained in this older way of writing television, still write shows with cold opens, and my least favorite kind, probably more so than the "it was all a dream" cold open, is the uh cold open that starts at the climactic scene of the episode
And
and
then
then
says
frames
one
the
hour late
entire rest
earlier.
of, and then frames the entire rest of the episode as a flashback to the cold open. I hate that. The
We're
only show that's
gonna get a
even done
couple
it
of those.
halfway successfully is The Good Guys, which was also a short-lived show on Fox.
A very good show.
Um, it's a terrible way, in
But
my
every
opinion,
episode
of
starts that way in that show.
structuring an episode. Yeah,
Yeah, I will
but
admit, I think that the flash forward cold open is super annoying. I like it when it's done sparingly, because it does force the writers to tell the story a little differently, but it definitely was way overused at this stage in broadcast TV.
how do you feel about? Um, I mean, I think it started off with Columbo, but lots of mystery shows do it now. Mystery shows with a cold open in which you watch the criminal perpetrating the crime, but some details are left out, and so you know from the very beginning of the show who done it. Like
Well,
I've been watching Monk recently. Monk follows this format. Like I said, I think it began with the 1970s detective drama Columbo.
I don't
Um,
like
but
knowing
lots of
who done
mystery
it.
shows do that.
I don't like knowing who done it. The Jeremy Brett TV show of Sherlock Holmes that ran from 84 to 94 did this a lot, and I only like it when you come to care about the victims or the client. I don't like it when, as is often done, it's mostly just to provide some shocking or titillizing violence or scary situation. I like it when you come to feel for the characters in the situation. You want the detective or the hero to save them from the thing. When it's just, oh, this guy got horribly murdered, I'd rather not. I'd rather they start on our main characters who we already care about. But
So
do you dislike this cold open where Sarah dreams of a Terminator attack and the end of the world?
I think it effectively conveys the main theme of the show. I like, the dream Terminator has the line, "The future belongs to us," which is sort of if Skynet has a thesis statement, that is the Skynet thesis statement, that humanity, as a species, is obsolete, and needs to be destroyed in order to make way for a better kind of sentience, um, which is represented by these Terminator cyborgs.
I would agree. I think that this is a mostly effective cold open. We do have the classic Terminator style voiceover from Sarah Connor, which opens a lot of these episodes and harkens back to the ending of the first Terminator movie, and of course the beginning and ending of the second Terminator movie. And a lot of the other Terminator movies have used the same thing. And I would say that in addition to being an emotionally evocative tool, it also is part of the roots of this whole genre in both the noir, detective, adventure, and horror storytelling roots of the Terminator franchise. And I
So
would
it's
say,
interesting you say. It's interesting that you say that because I in my opening monologue, I clearly framed the Terminator series as being within the horror genre. Is that how you experience the Terminator movies
only the
and this
first
TV
one.
show?
No, I experienced the movies primarily as a science fiction adventure. Um, I would say that the horror roots give it a lot more edge. This show is incredibly bleak. If you like a character, they almost always die. And I think that's very much a horror element rather than a science fiction element. Um,
Well, and I think that's, I think that is what makes the cold open effective is that it really does capture the bleakness of the worldview of the series and the franchise as a whole. The
yeah,
idea that at the very beginning of the show, it's telling you this is a show about characters that know for a fact that the world is going to end soon and that everyone that they know and love is going to die.
yep. And that they may survive, but their lives will be incredibly hard, and they have to spend all of their energy preparing and training for that dark future.
Right. So that leads to the next episode where Sarah Connor has woken up.
Oh, sorry, you
John
mean
is
the
getting
next act.
the next act. Yes, because there is a commercial break. Um, I was going to bring that up later, but yes, this show is structured very much so around the fact that there are commercial breaks, and so there's like stingers at the end of each act. So yes, after the theme song, after the commercial break, we see Sarah Connor waking up. She's apparently affianced to Dean Winters, uh,
Charlie.
who yes, who is not a comedic lunatic in this show, as he appears in the sitcom 30 Rock and the Progressive Mayhem commercials, but is in fact one of the sanest characters in this show.
I would say he's one of the
Very
most
rational,
moral.
dependable sort of person,
Yeah,
with medical skills, as we'll learn later.
to
Um,
his chagrin.
and so the first sort of conflict in this act is kind of setting up the idea that John wants to be a normal teenager, and Sarah is basically saying you can't be a normal teenager because we are never safe. And so this show brings up, in C.S. Lewis's essay on stories, he talks about how there are different kinds of fear. And so the kind of fear that we were introduced to in the cold open is the fear that a robot is going to come and kill you. Um, in this next act, we're introduced to a different kind of fear, which is a kind of existential dread or paranoia that pervades Sarah Connor and John Connor's lives, because they're constantly afraid that they might get apprehended by mundane, ordinary police, or that another time traveling cyborg will show up to kill them.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that even though the show shows us immediately that Sarah is right to fear the Terminators, to some extent, her fear is a self-fulfilling prophecy in them finding her and John. Her actions of running away lead to Charlie reporting, and that report goes into a computer, which the Terminators find.
Right. And it also alerts the mundane police authorities. And so we get this introduction of the character of Ellison, the FBI agent, who gives us a Terminator info dump for those of us who are unfamiliar with what happened in the first two movies and basically how this world works.
Yeah, I thought that was actually pretty elegantly done. There's a tendency in a lot of shows and movies to have a Basil exposition character who exists primarily to give you information in case you don't know stuff. I think that well-written shows like this one, I would say this show is generally well-written, find an organic way to introduce that information so that it feels like it would naturally come up and that it helps to provide characters with motivation. So it's not merely information, but it is character change and growth. And also Ellison, who I believe is probably named after Harlan Ellison, who was involved in a big lawsuit about the original Terminator story concept, is one of the best characters of the show. He starts this season as an FBI agent, and he has a lot of complex motivation and backstory. And I really like him. Who's he played by again? James Brooks or Robert Brooks?
You're going to make me look it up. He is played by... Oh, that's unhelpful.
Richard T. Jones.
Richard T. Jones.
Who was the most expensive actor on the show because of his experience on Judge Amy, I think it was.
Yes. Yes, he's an old TV hand, unlike most of the other people on this show. Although we will, I think, talk about some of the other casting choices and performances maybe in a future podcast episode. So you mentioned the fact that his name is Ellison. I think this is probably a kind of joke on the writer's part because in the same way that Harlan Ellison litigiously pursued the Terminator franchise and James Cameron, so the FBI agent Ellison will be pursuing our main characters.
And there's a lot of other characters who have this kind of clever name.
Yes, clever names. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about that in the next act. Will introduce us to another clever name, the other. I think the Ellison character is interesting, especially in this episode, because he's the audience surrogate. If you're, he's a normal person who does not necessarily believe that artificially intelligent robots are going to destroy the Earth
from the future.
From the future, are going to kill anybody. He serves as the skeptic, as the everyman, and I agree that he's a great character. So, as you said, the information gets put into a computer, which computers are very dangerous in this show, which provides us with our end of act sting, and we get cut to another commercial break. And then we are introduced to the first day at high school of one John Connor.
Going by John Reese at this time.
Yes, John Reese, ordinary teenager, listening to a Walkman CD player, which is something that lots of teenagers had in 1999 when this pilot episode is set.
So, do you feel like the 90s are overdone, underdone, or done just the right amount for this pilot?
Well, so it's interesting, and we'll probably talk about this more in future episodes. It's interesting that this show is set sort of in the more or less immediate aftermath of Terminator 2, which I think is probably still the most successful of the Terminator movies. I mean, you're the one who keeps in track of box office. Have any of the other movies made as much money as Terminator 2?
No, that is the one that made so much money that they felt they had to do sequels.
Right. So this movie is ignoring the existence of Terminator 3, although we'll see in the next episode that there's a callback to Terminator 3 in what happens to Sarah Connor. But the show is basically saying, like, hey, we know that Terminator 2 is your favorite movie of all time, so we're just going to say that this show that you're watching takes place just a few years after that.
Yeah,
So
specifically
that
about
everything that you liked about that movie will be in this show.
specifically the timeline is that they fudge with the dates a lot, which is something that all the Terminator movies do. So the first movie theoretically takes place in 1984. The second movie was released in 1991, but theoretically takes place in 1994. This movie, I think, pushes back the first movie by 3 years so that John is about 13 in 1994. And then no, I'm sorry. This movie pushes back T2 from 1994 to about 1996. So John is about 13 and he is 15 when the series starts in 1999.
Yes, John Connor's ordinary high school student. And I think one of this episode sets up a conflict which will continue throughout the series, which is John Connor plays, for the most part, a very ordinary teenage dude. And so the question is how does this ordinary teenage dude become the savior of humanity in a post-apocalyptic future? Does he have the requisite both technical and leadership skills to actually pull that off? And how does he acquire those skills? So this pilot, I think, is a good introduction to that sort of narrative problem, which is that you have to believe that this, kind of slacker teenager with baggy pants somehow saves the world.
I wouldn't say that John's necessarily supposed to be super normal. They reference the hacking that he does in T2 as being like a specific skill, and that does become more and more of a thing he has. And it also talks about how Sarah has trained him from basically birth with a lot of skills, mental and physical, that I think really increase the plausibility. I mean, I am somewhat of a heretic in not loving Terminator 2 as much of a lot of people. And a large part of that is because I don't buy that this really obnoxious cliche of a child stereotype in Terminator 2 becomes the leader of the resistance. I think Thomas Dekker does a
I'll be
much
even
better
more
job.
of a heretic by saying that I don't generally like James Cameron movies.
I
Like,
also don't really like most of them.
the 1984 Terminator is really the only James Cameron movie that I like. I think Terminator 2 is fine, and then I think his oeuvre since then has just gone downhill.
Unfortunately,
I
not
think
in
Titanic is
box office.
terrible. I think both of the Avatar movies are terrible. The Abyss isn't that great. That was earlier. Sorry. Yeah, the original Terminator is the only one that I think is legitimately good, and I think the other ones are either mediocre or terrible.
Well, we will be talking
So
about
I am even more of a heretic than you are, Ian.
we will be talking about every Terminator movie as they come up organically in the series, because there have been tons of podcasts about those movies. So we want to discuss them in context with the series and how they inform our love of the series or don't. So we have here, after all this 90s scene setting, a meet cute
Yes.
between John and Cameron.
Yes, played by Summer Glau. Who is do we get a strong sense of, I forget, do they tell us where this high school is, other than that it's in the middle of nowhere and therefore supposedly safe?
You know, I'm not 100% sure. The commentary says they filmed it in New Mexico, and I'm pretty sure that they mention New Mexico as being where it is. So it's in the southwestern United States, and I think it's probably New Mexico.
Okay, so there's this idea that it's somehow, despite the fact that he's theoretically spent most of his life growing up in Mexico
South America.
and South America, that somehow John Connor is an urban sophisticate who's too cool for this hick town. And Cameron comes in with her bootcut jeans and her cowboy boots and her plaid shirt, and charms the pants off of him just by being Summer Glau. Do you feel like you get enough of a hint that there is something up with this character other than the fact that she's played by Summer Glau?
I think the problem is they spent the entire marketing budget of the show for the first season telling us Cameron was a Terminator.
So the ruse does not work
for
for the audience. The ruse does not work for the audience, especially if you saw any teasers for this show.
Or like the cover of the freaking box of the DVDs or anything.
But apparently it works for John Connor. He's completely fooled. This is obviously a really nice looking teenage girl that he should get to know better, and not a deadly killing machine.
So why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about Summer Glau?
Okay.
Summer Glau, of course, was discovered by Joss Whedon in his show Angel as a guest star who played a ballerina, and she was originally a ballet dancer, a classically trained ballet dancer. She stopped doing ballet because of an injury, but she obviously still loves it, and in many of the shows and movies she does, they incorporate that dance training and physicality into her character. At this time, she had finished her show Firefly with Whedon, and also the movie Serenity, which was a sequel to the show. And I want to say she was in a different show as a guest character, but she was a free agent, and she was the most popular actor in the show at the time, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I don't... Lena Headey had done Brothers Grimm. I think that's the first thing that I had ever seen her in.
Remains of the Day.
The Terry Gilliam movie starring Heath Ledger and Matt Damon as Willem and Jakob Grimm, monster hunters, not academic folklorists. And a very silly performance by Peter Stormare as some sort of Napoleonic general. And if I recall, a extremely scary gingerbread man. I think that was the most miserable. That was the most memorable monster that they hunted in that movie.
I get that confused with the Hansel and Gretel movie 10 years later, so I don't remember it.
That movie is even worse.
It was not a good movie.
The Brothers Grimm is not Terry. I like Terry Gilliam. Brothers Grimm is not Terry Gilliam's best movie. But Lena Headey looks incredible in that movie. And so I think for me, more so than Summer Glau, I was excited. I was like, oh man, the hot chick from Brothers Grimm is in this show, and she plays Sarah Connor. Were you at all off put by the fact that she does not look? I mean, she kind of looks like Linda Hamilton if you imagine her with blonde hair. But really, she doesn't look like Linda Hamilton at all. Was that at all off-putting for you when you first saw the show, or did you not have enough attachment to the first two movies to care?
I did not have enough attachment to the first two movies to care. That is a very good description of my. I mean, let's put it this way: when this show aired, and this is actually still a true statement, my favorite Terminator movie was the third movie. So,
In
I
which
was
Sarah
not.
Connor is. We were going to talk about that later, but I guess we can mention it now. In the third movie, Sarah Connor is dead.
Yes,
So very different timeline continuity that the third movie is maintaining from this show.
but provides a
But
very
no,
important
yeah.
theme.
So I think a lot of people at the time, if I recall, were off put by the fact that she has dark brown black hair rather than blonde hair. But she does kind of have like the
Just that
poofy
feathered
feathered
80s look
bangs.
from the first
Yeah.
movie.
So similar haircut if different uh hair color.
Yeah, I think we should talk about Lena
Does
Headey later. So,
we will return to this subject.
she is, of course, the title character, but there are other episodes that I think dig into her character better.
Yes. So they meet cute. We get introduced to a substitute teacher whose name is Cromarty, which is another clever name. Because we discover soon enough that he is actually made out of chrome. And pulls a gun out of his leg, which you sent a link to review that goes to great length explaining why this is preposterous. I don't think anybody who saw this pilot for the first time would care. It just looks cool. Yes, so he pulls a gun out of his leg. I think it is important. Not only does it just look cool, I was going to talk about this later. Not only does it look cool, but it establishes something that is I think, important part of the first two movies, especially the first movie, which is that Terminators start off looking like pristine, near godlike humans, but that through the course of a typical Terminator story, they slowly degrade in their human lookingness, and eventually look like monsters. So all Terminators go through this journey of starting off looking like angels and ended up looking like monsters, which I think is an interesting theme and visual motif. So the fact that he rips open his leg in order to grab this gun feeds into that motif.
Well, it also is
That
important in Ellison's journey because that allows Ellison to know there really is something weird going on. It's not just Sarah Connor terrorist.
Right. We will talk more about the terrorist theme probably in the next episode because it's pretty important to the next episode. Fantastic conclusion to this act, which is that Cromarty gets hit by a pickup truck. I love it when things get hit by pickup trucks. It's always a great way to end the scene. And our girl Cameron gets to say the iconic Terminator franchise line, "Come with me if you want to live." And then we go to a commercial break.
I would say this is definitely one of the best "Come with me if you want to lives."
I mean, I would if Summer Glau killed a robot with a pickup truck and then swung open the door and asked me to come with her if I wanted to live, I would hop up in the pickup truck.
I mean, I feel like if Summer Glau just drove up without killing a robot and said that, you might still want to get in the car.
I mean, I'm intrigued. Why do I have to come with you in order to live? You know? It is interesting that the catchphrase is a hypothetical. I thought about this a little bit before we started recording the show. It's come with me if you want to live. So it's like, if you don't want to live, just do whatever you want to do, man. But if you want to live, you have to come with me.
Well, it's a striking phrase. It lasts better with just "come with me." Like a lot of people say "come with me," and I guess one of the most iconic phrases in the Terminator franchise is "I'll be back." But I think a lot of that is Arnold's accent.
Oh well, I forgot to mention that. Yes, so Cromartie, our Terminator antagonist for this first part of the series, is gets his own Arnie like joke catchphrase after he shoots up the classroom. He turns, and I think, does he actually look at the camera, like look at us, the audience, and say "class dismissed"? I think he does.
I can't remember the
It's an
eye
Arnie
lines,
joke.
but I think it definitely felt like that.
It's an Arnie joke.
Yes.
And yeah, so then we go to our final act, in which there is much flip cell phone usage, which is again another technology callback to 1999. So everyone has flip phones, which is different from older TV shows in which no one has a phone and therefore communication is difficult. And often the plots of older TV shows would not make any sense in a post cell phone era, because people would just call each other on cell phones. But in this TV show, them having cell phones actually causes a complication, which is that Terminators are able to replicate human voices by grabbing hold of somebody's vocal cords with their hands. Interesting.
I think theoretically the idea is that they just have to hear someone speak and then they can replicate them. Because I don't remember Cameron grabbing John's throat, and she imitates him in this movie. I mean, this episode.
That's true. Maybe you only need to hear their voice. Maybe you don't actually need
I think
to
this is
grab
basically
their
Mission
throat.
Impossible rules, where they do a recording and then they synthesize a voice.
Yes.
Although at this point, I
Mission
don't know.
Impossible rules.
Yeah, I guess they had
Mission
Mission
Impossible
Impossible
doesn't
3.
make sense to me. I know it's something that they took from the old TV show. It doesn't make sense in the old TV show. It doesn't make sense in any of the movies. How did they create these masks? Where did the voices come from? It doesn't make any sense. But if you're a robot from the future, it makes sense.
Right. Robots from the future have magical CPUs, which brings us to our next set of the brain reset of the chip.
Yes. So this episode, there's a fight sequence. We get Terminator versus Terminator fight, which is always fun.
Which is mostly them
We'll
picking
see
each
lots
other up
more of those
and
in the
hitting each other.
series. Yes. It's always fun watching robots fight other robots. It's usually not as fun watching robots fight humans because the robots
Because the
win.
humans lose.
Right. And so yes, we get this important exposition from Cameron that will play a role, I think, in other future episodes of the series as well, which is that if you use a lot of electricity to shock a Terminator, it takes 120 seconds for its brain to reset, which is hopefully enough time, 2 minutes, hopefully enough time for you to get away.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that the show does to set up rules so that these fights feel less hopeless.
Yes.
And that's a big one.
Which is in this the article that you sent me, who is the author of the article, since we
David Hines.
Yes. He talks about this problem. I don't think that it's quite a big a deal as he makes of it, but yes, the part of the struggle with storytelling in this series is that in a movie, especially a very short movie like the original Terminator movie, a a lot of dramatic tension comes from the fact that the Terminator is virtually unstoppable until the climactic moments of the movie. Whereas in this show, it's a TV series, so you have to have multiple episodes, multiple stories within the overarching arc of the series. Not all Terminators can be unstoppable in this show, or otherwise the show would end very quickly. And so you have to come up with new ways to stop Terminators in order to have a Terminator TV show. Perhaps similar to the proliferation of zombie TV shows that have occurred since Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles. In classic zombie movies, zombies are unstoppable. But obviously, if you're going to have a zombie TV show, you have to come up with ways to stop zombies.
After they escape from the Terminator, our heroes have to recuperate because they've taken quite a bit of damage. Obviously, Cameron's taken the most, but Sarah has been shot, I think. Oh no, she gets shot a little later.
Humans are squishier than robots. We get a little bit of Summer Glau fan service with a strategically placed camera angle.
When she is repairing her skin after being shot.
Yes, which this comes up somewhat in Terminator 3, which came out in 2003.
Yeah.
But yes, the giving a Terminator a female sex characteristics creates a different dynamic than the first two Terminator movies, in which the Terminators are played by men.
Mostly. I mean, the T-1000 does appear as the foster mother briefly, and does one of the most horrifying things that you see in the movie as that character, but yes, mostly it is male.
Yeah, and so do you feel like on a sort of visceral and iconic level, a female Terminator is a different kind of Terminator than a male Terminator? Like it like activates different parts of your, like I framed the beginning of this episode of this podcast by saying there's something deeply sort of visceral and like back of your brain, I don't like the phrase lizard brain, back of your brain feeling of being chased by something dangerous. Does that change if the thing that is dangerous looks like Summer Glau?
I mean, Summer Glau is very athletic, but she's not huge. She's not very tall. She's not very bulky. The last female Terminator was significantly taller and bulkier, but she was still played by, I think, a model or a previous model. And of course, anything made in Hollywood is generally going to have attractive people playing them. I think that they're definitely playing with the dissonance between Cameron being a Terminator who can pick up and destroy and kill with the same amount of strength as a male Terminator, and her appearance and her relationship with John and Sarah.
Yeah, I didn't write this down in my notes. I did think it's an interesting choice. I think this bothered me more than the ripping the gun out of the leg that bothered the other writer. When Cromartie flips over a 16-wheel truck,
school bus
for school bus for no reason other than to stand on top of it, and prove that he can flip over school buses. It just seems it seemed even more unnecessary than the ripping the gun out of the leg.
I would say that Cromartie
it does impress upon the audience that Terminators are very strong.
Well, I mean, partly because when they were filming in the commentary, they mentioned that when they were filming, the people in charge of the set they were using said, "We can flip this bus," and so the writers were like, "Have him flip the bus."
I mean, why not? Why not?
It looks cool, and they had the budget to do it, which is
There you
always a
go.
big problem in TV versus movies. Movies are
So,
going to
in
have.
addition to giving us some fan service, Cameron does give us a new exposition point, which is that Judgment Day has shifted from what it was in the second Terminator movie. So we have a new date for Judgment Day, which is April. She says Skynet will come online on April 19th, 2011. I think in a later episode, the actual nuclear launch, Judgment Day, will occur on April 21st, 2011. So that we have a new Judgment Day. And she also establishes a new goal, which will carry forward for the rest of the series, which is that rather than simply running away from the Terminators, they will be actually pursuing Skynet and attempting to destroy it. So she says, stop running, stop Skynet, and find Skynet and destroy it. So this is a new goal that our characters have. And that kind of concludes the this act.
Do you think that the show ever commits to stopping Skynet as a realistic goal?
Well, we will talk about this eventually. In season 2, we gain new information that changes the audience's perspective on that goal. But I think it remains the goal solidly for this first season, which is of course shorter than a 22 or 24 episode season.
Yeah.
But it is, again, going back to the problem of creating a Terminator TV show as opposed to a Terminator movie. If your movie's only 90 minutes long, it's perfectly fine to have Sarah Connor running away from a Terminator for 90 minutes. But if you're going to have a TV show, Sarah Connor has to have a more proactive goal, or otherwise she becomes essentially an antagonist and the Terminator becomes a protagonist. It's not a strong character position. So the goal of destroying Skynet is a much stronger character position to build the TV show on.
Yeah. We'll definitely have to return to this, especially when we get to season 2 and it feels like the future is both changing and not changing in very interesting ways. But I think it's interesting that John changes his mother's mind. He basically forces her to stop running, which is her preferred plan, and fight.
And perhaps we get a hint of sort of the emotional core of this show for much of the show, which is that not only is this a cool science fiction show about fighting robots, but this is a coming of age story about a young person, a young man, gaining a certain measure of independence from his parent, and coming up with goals for himself that are different from his parents' goals.
Yeah. And I think it's great. And one of the things that this show definitely sort of looked forward to the future about is that almost every character has a very detailed and complicated arc. Even though this is titled the Sarah Connor Chronicles, John and Cameron and other characters and Ellison and other characters who are introduced later become just as important in the audience's investment and even the plot's resolution as Sarah herself.
So they decide to fight Skynet, find Skynet, fight Skynet, destroy Skynet. And so they travel to Southern California to the home of Miles Dyson's widow. I feel like this is probably the weakest act of this episode. It seems unnecessary for them to scare Miles Dyson's widow and blow up part of her house.
Yeah, this is
But I
very
guess
much
the plot motivation is that they need to switch vehicles, and they also need to travel to Southern California in order for the climax of the episode to make sense.
I agree it feels weak. It's clearly intending to set up something that won't become active until the finale of season 2. Although we do get a return to Miles's widow. Is it next episode or an episode? It's a pretty soon episode, but I don't think it's the next episode. I could be wrong. But
the fact that they return to that character in a later episode makes this scene seem unnecessary. It's just like her house gets blown up by a Terminator for no reason.
It's much more, I think, about those nostalgia, because you have the basic same idea of the robots are still coming when Cameron's eyes light up blue, and but yeah, it doesn't seem super necessary, and I think it mostly exists so that they can blow up their pickup truck and damage Cromartie enough that he doesn't function as well anymore,
and makes that more full transition from angel to monster. By the end of the scene, he no longer looks like a pristine, healthy human. He looks like something from a horror movie, with parts of his scalp missing, and bits of blood and chrome showing.
And he does shoot Sarah in this getaway, which is important.
He does.
And unfortunately, I think introduces one of the ongoing problems with how the show handles one of the central elements of Terminator lore, time travel.
Yes, so we'll talk about that. But I just had a thought while I was processing why I think the Miles Dyson widow scene doesn't work as well for me, which is that maybe this is a good character motivation for the scene. Maybe it highlights the short-term thinking of Sarah Connor as opposed to the more long-term thinking of John Connor and Cameron, which is that she's basically just there to be like, shake Mrs. Dyson by the shoulders and be like, tell me how to destroy the robots. And the widow is like, I don't know. It's like I said, it seems to indicate a certain level of short-term or short-sightedness on Sarah Connor's part.
Well, remember that Sarah is someone who didn't go to college. She was a waitress, just sort of hanging out before she got sucked into this nightmare. She had no
and she's
training.
Still a waitress in the dream sequence at the beginning of the show.
She's still a waitress when John School gets attacked. Like she sees she's carrying food to someone. She sees John School getting attacked on the TV, drops her plate, and then vamoose.
You would think with all the skills that she's acquired since the first movie that there would be more career opportunities available to her, but perhaps not. If you're a fugitive from the law,
that's the big thing is she can't be anything.
You're skipped from a mental institution.
Yeah, you can't do anything that gets attention. So waitress, where oftentimes they don't even ask for significant proof of identity, is a pretty good option for someone who wants to stay on below the radar.
Yes.
And we'll definitely need to talk about the economics of this show in future episodes.
So then we move to our final episode in which Cameron has a plan. She has a plan. So they go to this bank, and this sets up one of the things that in 2008 that I really liked about this show, and I still really like about this show, which is, I think, maybe more so than most television shows, and maybe even many uh, novels. This show has interesting things to say about time travel, and it plays with time travel in interesting ways. And so Cameron's idea is that they will somehow use a prefabricated time machine that was built in the 1960s by another Terminator.
No, it was
Uh,
built by a technician that the Resistance sent back.
Good point. We'll get the way back Terminator in a future episode.
Oh, it's one of the best episodes.
It is. It's a Self-Made Man is one of the best episodes. We'll
Such
get
a
to it
good
eventually.
episode.
So the technician from the future builds the bank in the 1960s. The similar to the 122nd Terminator brain freeze exposition. What we have been told in previous Terminator installments, the first two movies, is that only flesh and bone can travel in these kinds of time machines. And so that's the entire motivation for having cyborgs in the first place, is that they have to have a biological shell in order to travel back through time.
Although Terminator 2 immediately ignores that and has the liquid metal Terminator traveling back. Although in certain novelizations of the movie, they argue that they send them back in a biodegradable sheath covering the pool of matter, and it takes on a form when it travels through. But this show completely ignores that. And also, Sarah has a stitched bullet wound. She was shot, and the very next day she travels through time. She has a stitched bullet wound, and Cameron has several stitched bullet wounds, which I think means that we kind of have to ignore the rules of everything.
It establishes significantly different rules. If I remember correctly, we'll probably talk about this more in a future episode. If I remember correctly, it's explicitly stated in the first movie that you can only travel backwards in time using these kinds of time machines. So it's always a one-way trip backwards in time.
Well, I
up
think the
until
reason they
this
say that,
episode.
I think, yes, well, that's a major thing. But I think the reason they say you can only go back in time is because the technology is invented in the future, and it requires a fairly significant infrastructure to send someone back in time. But the idea that you can send someone back who knows the plans, I think, explains it. I don't think that there's anything inherent in the first Terminator movie that says you can't go forward in time. It just means that you have to have a time machine to go forward or backwards in time, and no one who knows how to make one lives in the past.
Yes. So it establishes one of the dominant themes for the show, which, as I said, is one of the themes that I find the most fascinating, is the way this show deals with time travel and the paradoxes thereof. We've already mentioned previously in that Judgment Day shifts. So there can be a new date for Judgment Day based on actions that occur in the present. We've gotten a hint that somehow Skynet gets invented by someone other than Miles Dyson, which is another change to the future based
Although
on
the
actions that
interesting
have
thing
occurred
is
in the present.
they usually don't change the date from which the Resistance and Skynet are sending their fighters. It's usually from sometime between 2027 and 2029.
True.
So the battle gets
Possibly
shorter.
because of what you just said, which is that presumably there's a period between Judgment Day and 2027, in which time machine technology has not been fully developed yet. And so it's
Yes.
not until later decades that time travel is possible for both Skynet and the Resistance.
Yeah.
And so we get Cromarty's head gets blown off.
Yes. Although
Which
this
will
is not
become very
clear.
important.
This is not clear in the pilot. You actually have to watch the previously on section of the next episode to actually see what happens.
Yes.
It's very weird.
So if you only watch the pilot, you could be fooled into thinking that their problem has been solved by traveling into the future. But in fact, it is not, as we'll see in the next episode, it has not been solved. They're still being pursued by a Terminator that wants to kill them. But there's this role reversal that happens at the end of this episode. In the first two movies, the idea is that Skynet is attempting to kill Sarah Connor, or John Connor, in order to prevent a future human resistance. This show is establishing itself as being a role reversal of that, in which the human resistance is attempting to destroy Skynet before it is invented, before it is born, as they say.
And I will make some more points about that later on when we get closer to significant plot points. But I think it's really interesting the way the show plays with machines and humans and the way they resemble each other.
Yes, we didn't really talk about that. I kind of skipped that part of my notes, but you have frequent references in this episode to the concept of programming and how there may be both Terminator programming and a kind of human programming that Sarah feels like she can program John. And famously, humans are more resistant to programming than robots are. And so John does not always do what Sarah wants him to do.
So, how much of the choice to time travel to 2007 do you feel was so that they didn't have to spend so much money and time on establishing 1999 as the setting?
I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, there are practical reasons for changing the setting from the late 90s to 2007. I think it does. Like I said, this show is interested not only in sort of the mechanics of time travel, but also sort of the human emotions and, like I said, paradoxes that attend time travel. And so, in the first, we'll talk about this more in future episodes, but in the first couple of episodes, the show does deal with sort of a fish out of water element to traveling into the future, in which, despite John Connor's technical prowess, he doesn't necessarily understand all the technologies that have developed in the intervening 8 years. And I also think, and again, this kind of goes to my grand cultural theory of many of these science fiction television shows, especially that came out during this time period. They skip a very significant portion of cultural history because in the United States, because they skip over 9/11 and the majority of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. So The show is set in 2007, was released in 2008. By the end of the series, George W. Bush will no longer be president. Barack Obama will be president. And I think it will be interesting to explore the ways in which the show wants to pretend like the years between 1999 and 2007 didn't happen, both for these characters and culturally for the show.
Yep, that definitely will be something that we should dive into, both why they might want to do it emotionally, why they might want to do it philosophically, why they might want to do it politically. There's lots of things that are going into this decision, or the consequences of the decision.
Because despite the fact that she is correct about robots taking over the Earth in the future, from a certain perspective, Sarah Connor is a terrorist. But she's a terrorist from a cultural error before 9/11. And what a terrorist is in 2007 for most of us means something very different than it did in 1991.
And what a
Because
war.
1991 was not only before 9/11, it was also before Ruby Ridge, before Waco, before the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah. It's something we will definitely have to talk about as our podcast continues and as we watch the various movies. Will be, what are the fears? What are the cultural tensions driving the depiction of the humans and the robots and the various sides? And why are they fighting? Why do we care about them fighting? Because those all change with basically every movie, because between the first and the second movie, you have the fall of the Soviet Union, which radically changes so much of the conflict. Because I think the first movie is very much a Cold War movie. And then between the second movie and the third movie, you have 9/11. And between the third movie and the fourth movie, you have that shift between the war on terror and the Obama presidency. And it just keeps going. The conflicts keep changing that produce these movies.
Well, I have more thoughts on that, but obviously we'll talk about them another time. Is there
These are
anything
future
else
thoughts.
anything else you want to discuss in this episode before we sign off?
I think, interestingly, my view of TV pilots is usually they're very weak because they're usually produced by a different set of people than the people who end up producing the main show, because it's usually the showrunner and a couple people and the cast, and oftentimes they'll recast characters and have completely different directors and completely different production staff. This one feels a lot more organic with the rest of the show. And part of that is because they cheated, because they had that huge time jump at the end of the episode. So anything different about the next few episodes, well, obviously, they're 8 years further in the future, so it's going to feel different. But I think this is actually a very strong pilot compared to a lot of other shows.
It is. It's a very strong pilot. Many of my favorite TV shows have strong pilots. I would say that this is one of them. It knows what it wants from the very beginning.
Yes, it does. Even though it changes a lot between the first episode and our finale.
Yes. All right. Well, this has been an episode of Come With Me If You Want to Live. And do you want to say it, Ian, or shall I?
Why don't you stay it for this first episode?
We'll be back.